Stephen, what are the Chinese officials saying?
Well, John, the Chinese Foreign Ministry just issued a brief statement voicing its strong opposition to the latest test. It urges North Korea to abide by its international commitments and to stop any action that would further worsen the situation. It also repeats China's long-held position that it wants to see a nuclear-free Korean peninsula and says the only way to achieve that is through dialogues and talks in the framework of the so-called six-party talks. Now, John, these are not surprising points. What's more interesting is a commentary published by the state-run Xinhua news agency a little earlier. That article did point out that the latest test was in violation of UN resolutions, but also it says it puts the whole thing in the context of the South Korean government's decision to deploy the THAAD missile defense system, saying that decision has seriously harmed the region's strategic balance and has triggered the escalation of tensions in the region. So then it lists this latest test as well as more recent missile tests as examples, trying to drive home the point China has been making that the THAAD deployment would trigger an arms race here in the region. So it seems interesting that the Chinese government here is trying to address several audiences, not only to Pyongyang but also to Seoul and Washington as well, probably to a domestic audience as well, John, because remember, anytime these kind of tests happen, it has a concrete impact on residents of the border region. Earlier today, state media reported residents living in northeastern China felt strong and very obvious tremors at the time of the nuclear test. And the Ministry of Environmental Protection also said they have launched an emergency response by starting to measure radiation levels in the border region, although so far no abnormal readings have been reported. John?
Stephen, we should note that the South Koreans deployed that THAAD missile defense system, which they got from the United States. I think it was because of the ballistic missile launches by the North Koreans. So this just goes on and on and on. But given that editorial in Xinhua, nothing happens in China without the communist government controlling it, putting it out there. Is that an indication then that when this gets to the Security Council, the Chinese are going to be less than enthusiastic in supporting further sanctions and punishing the North Koreans, instead putting the blame perhaps on the South Koreans?
Well, John, the Chinese government in more recent years or months have been grudgingly, going along with tougher UN sanctions against North Korea because Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, after he took power 3 years ago, had also felt a lot of frustration and anger with the North Koreans' repeated defiance against international rules and sanctions. But as I mentioned, because of the THAAD deployment, things are getting a little more complex because the Chinese is trying to play a game of striking some sort of balance. And so we have seen some sort of thawing between Beijing and Pyongyang recently. Xi Jinping received a senior delegation from Pyongyang back in June, but now with the latest nuclear test, that may be thrown off the table as well. So from the Beijing's perspective, this is definitely a situation that it does not want to see, John.
It's a long time since the relationship has been described as being like lips and teeth, isn't it, Stephen? Thank you very much, Stephen Chang.